Here in Pompeii, famously, time stopped in 79 AD. The eruption buried all the buildings up to their roofs, and with the exception of the occasional scavenger, they remained more or less undisturbed until excavations began in the 18th century. But what might Pompeii look like today if Vesuvius hadn't erupted? What if, like thousands of other Roman cities, Pompeii had continued to develop through the Middle Ages and Renaissance? Would any of the buildings that are so famous today still exist? We can't know, of course, but there's an interesting parallel only a few miles from here that gives us some clues. Let's start here with the Capitolium in Pompeii's Forum. This was a temple dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. As was often the case in Roman colonies, it was the dominant structure on the Forum and stood on a tall podium. Although the temple was badly damaged in the earthquake of 62 AD and had not yet been restored at the time of the eruption, it certainly would have been had the Pompeians been given more time. What would it have looked like today? It might have looked a bit like this. This is the church of San Paolo Maggiore in Naples. Originally, it was a temple dedicated to the Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri. It stood on the Forum, which has been reduced now to this small plaza. A church was built inside the temple, whose colonnaded portico survived until a 17th century earthquake. You can still see the two surviving columns jutting from the Baroque facade. I can imagine the Capitolium of Pompeii looking like this today, a church on a small piazza surrounded by bustling streets. This is Pompeii's large theater. In its current form, it dates to the 1st century BC. It had seats for about 5,000 spectators. In modern cities lucky enough to have them, ancient theaters like this are often restored and used for concerts. But during the Middle Ages, theaters and other entertainment buildings were often torn apart for their stone, like the Colosseum, or simply built over. The Roman theater of Naples was larger than its counterpart in Pompeii. Over the past 15 centuries, however, it has been completely covered by later buildings. If you look closely, you can make out the curve of the theater wall. Those arches overhead are buttresses, added in the 3rd century in response to earthquake damage. If Pompeii had not been destroyed, there's a good chance its theater would have ended up looking something like this. Perhaps the most famous of Pompeii's streets is this one, which the archaeologists dubbed the Via dell'Abbondanza. It's a classic Roman street, straight as the surveyors could make it, relatively narrow, and bounded by raised sidewalks on both sides. Naples had a similar orthogonal street network. Remarkably, despite centuries of intensive occupation and reuse, the modern streets of the city center still follow the paths of their buried Roman predecessors. Here, for example, is the Via dei Tribunali, which follows the course of the ancient Decumanus Maximus, the chief east-west thoroughfare. Besides its orientation, nothing suggests that this was a Roman street. The ancient street, like the buildings beside it, is buried deep. This might have been Pompeii, a mix of medieval, Renaissance, and ancient buildings, crowding streets unrecognizable as anything ancient. It seemed fitting to close with this structure, the medieval bell tower of the Church of Santa Maria della Pietrasanta on the Via dei Tribunali. As you can see, the walls are decorated with spolia, fragments of ancient buildings. These are almost the only bits of Roman Naples still visible above ground. If Pompeii hadn't been buried by Vesuvius, its ancient buildings would likely have been scavenged in the same way. We can't know, in short, how Pompeii would have evolved if Vesuvius had spared the city, but we can be confident that, as in so many other Roman cities, the present would conceal the past.